What I want to do, as proposed in the advertisement flyers, is to share with you how what I call the change in the normative temper of the international community has resulted in the disintegration, or definitely the reinterpretation of the cardinal moral concept upon which the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention was constructed. Now, for my young friend who is from the politics department and other people here who are acquainted with the international relations theory, you would already notice that I use the word normative temper, because within the international relations debate, there is quite an antagonism from the realists or the new realists against the use of this sort of term. They argue that the international community is essentially anarchic and that what prevails is power and political interest, and therefore to be talking about the normative or moral temper of the international community is a misnomer. I come from the theoretical tradition that challenged this sort of claim by saying that the international community or international relations in general is not beyond the pale of morality, that there are indeed moral contestations within the international community, and that ethics occupy a central role in international relations. However, as I will show later in the presentation, this is not all kind of smooth sailing for those of us that argue on the role of ethics, because actually the role of power and interest is very, very palpable and easily seen. But what we are caught up with, as it were, is that despite the epochal changes in the international order, theories have not quite caught up, if you like, with these changes. I will suggest, if we have time, that what we need is an analysis or a theoretical construct that captures the fundamental role of structure and power, and especially economic interest, but marries that somehow with the role of ethics and justice. Sort of neo-Gramscian analysis coupled with some kind of ethical analysis is what we need. But anyway, back to the climate change regime, which you will find in some areas quite boring technical detail. So I've tried to put some cartoon to, people like Steve to keep them happy. In 1992, well, in the early 80s and late 80s, the notion of man-made climate change entered into the mainstream political debate, resulting in 1992 in the agreement of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We then had the Kyoto Protocol following on from that, which allocated the developed countries some quantified emission reduction targets. The target was about 5.5% relative to 1990 baseline, and they were supposed to achieve this mitigation target between 2008 and 2012. So we call it the commitment period. The idea has always been that after that there will be a second commitment period, a third commitment period, and the Kyoto Protocol will roll on and on. However, it became quite clear soon after the Kyoto Protocol was agreed that all was not well, because essentially the United States rejected the Kyoto Protocol, saying that, note, it was not fair, because it had not committed China to substantial emission reduction commitment. This actually, if you look very closely, resolved into three key aspects. A symmetry in contribution, a symmetry in impact, and a symmetry in the power to decide. Okay, so these are the key three equity connections with climate change. In terms of contribution, quite clearly, that there is, especially in historical terms, that the developed world bear a disproportionate. The second is asymmetry in impact. And this becomes essentially a justice issue, because the people or the nations that are far more responsible for causing the problem are not the one that will bear the main brunt of the impact of climate change. And what this graph shows you is the clear correlation between vulnerability to climate change and extent of development. So the more developed you are, the less vulnerable you are to climate change. And whether you disaggregate that to different sectors such as health or the number of deaths, what becomes unavoidably clear is the fact that developing countries who have contributed the least are bearing the most impact of climate change. And you see this media stunt by the government of Maldives prior to Copenhagen, where the entire government went underwater to hold their cabinet meeting, to draw attention to the fact that if nothing is done, that the whole of the atolls, the Maldives, the Tuvalus, the Tongas, they will be wiped away. But, you know, flooding in Bangladesh, drought in Africa, they all indicate quite clearly that developing countries are already bearing the brunt of climate change and will continue to do so disproportionately. And finally, you have the asymmetry in the power to decide. So this graph, which was compiled by myself and my research assistant when I was in Oxford, clearly shows the disproportionate representation of the developed country around the tables of climate governance compared to the developing countries. So in some instances, you find that you have zero, okay, nobody from a particular country in Africa, for example, against 162 from the developed country. And what I've done is to kind of place the countries side by side, the population, so that gives really tells a story. And this is how a cartoonist captures the difference in the ability to decide. That lady there facing a horde of developed country negotiators. Remember the first graph I showed you, or the picture, and the complexity. So you have to have deep understandings about law, about the science of emission, about economics of emission reduction, about how forests works, carbon in the forest, and all sorts of things. So very, very asymmetrical indeed. And so what you have is this graph, something that, I can't see your point. Let's just characterize the level of disagreement that marked the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiation. What is interesting, however, is that despite the differences in the original positions of the developed and the developing countries, they still managed towards the end to innovate, to come up with this concept called common but differentiated responsibility. This concept proved very, very important in actually getting even the developed and the developing countries to sit around the table and talk about the specific aspects of climate change. What this concept did was to establish that, okay, we are in this together, quote unquote, but that the contributions are kind of asymmetrical, that the impact is asymmetrical, that the ability to decide is asymmetrical, and that we have to take into account this asymmetry as we talk about the specific legal instruments or policy instruments for solving the problem. Very innovative concept. In itself, it does not actually specify particular policies, but it provides a powerful moral, if you like, tool to glue and bind the various countries together. As I said, it recognizes that it's a common problem, which is what the developed countries we are stressing, but at the same time recognizes differences in impact, which was what the developing countries we are stressing. You will see as I go on that this disagreement continues to prevail because developed countries stress the common aspect of it, developing countries stress the differentiated aspect of it. So they managed to agree that concept, and then that made it into Article 3.1. All parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations on the basis of equity in an accordance with the common but differentiated responsibility principles. And that was etched in the agreement and makes its way in nearly every major document arising from the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. So you see that Echo magazine, which was a magazine that kind of reports on the day-to-day negotiations in court, came up with a kind of a cartoon and said that the CBDR, a common body for has led to a way out of this kind of morally perverse cartoon. In practical terms, what the CBDR meant was that the key documents arising from the climate change negotiation incorporated the notion of historical responsibility. Okay? So even though emissions are changing, we recognize that developed countries are at least historically responsible for climate change. It also recognized the concept of per capita emission, which means equality amongst all living human beings. Okay? Because after all, if you go by absolute emission, the responsibility changes. And this was quite crucial for developing countries who were under attack by developed countries to reduce the, to kind of agree some population control measures. And so they recognize that at the end of the day, it is per person per emission that is important as opposed to absolute emission. Most importantly, they agreed in dividing the whole world, as it were, into two camps, Annex A, Annex B, which translated to Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. Developed countries were to take on quantified emission reduction targets or obligations, QERO, and the developing countries were exempted from taking quantified emission reduction targets. This, by far, was the most crucial aspect of the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC. But in addition, there were a number of other things that made developing countries quite happy, and those of us who have been arguing on the need for equity. So financial transfer was agreed, technology transfer, capacity building, and crucially, the action of developing countries were made conditionality on the receipt of this financial and technological assistance. Here are two examples. It says, developed countries shall provide new and additional funding to meet agreed full incremental cost of implementing measures. Industrialized countries are required to take all practical steps to promote and facilitate technology transfer. And the extent, and this was the one that gladdened India the most, the extent to which developing countries parties will implement the obligations conditional to receiving adequate technological and financial support from the developed countries. Now, even though developing countries kind of felt that they agreed a good deal and that equity was represented effectively, in practice, the developed countries never actually lived up to the agreements and the commitments they made. I don't have time to go into detail to verify this, so I produced only one graph to show the difference between the amount pledged and the amount actually disbursed. Okay, that is phenomenal. That shows you that words matter, but actually, they don't count when it comes to practice. There's a number of, Lego, technical, boring things I can go into detail about. For example, you remember what I read to you, that, developed countries shall provide new and additional funding. Who defines what is new? Who defines what is additional? They will take all practical steps, but, I can say I did my best, and you can say I didn't do my best. And so although developing countries were kind of happy, and to use Hillary's term, which I actually saw for the very first time today, kind of they bottled up their joy with some drinks. But in the end, it proved quite naive, because when it comes really down to negotiating what is the new and additional, they saw that there was quite a leeway, and that the CBDR wasn't actually strong enough, and this is again what I'm going to come to later, even if it was strong enough, the fact that there is no measure existing today to make any country to do anything in the international community is still quite a big problem, despite the movement in some cases towards this so-called global community that is contracting. Okay. Now, moving forward, as I indicated earlier, the position of the developed country begin to harden. The U.S. led a charge, and as I speak to you, there is a bill in the House that is being considered that the U.S. is forbidden from taking on any emission reduction target that is not similar in the nature and feel of the targets taken on by India, China, and Russia. EU also became quite weary, battle weary, especially given the expansion of the EU and the fact that the countries like Poland joined, which actually had the need to grow their emissions. And the EU ETS, and Peter has commented on this, and so has not quite worked as it was expected. There was, some people say, it's down to implementation problems. Some people say it's design problem. I say it's far more fundamental, it's more structural. But again, there's no time to go into that. And what we now find is increasing classification and moving apart of the developed and the developing countries as nations gathered periodically to try and agree what is going to replace the Kyoto Protocol. And so what I'm going to do in the next 4 minutes or 5 minutes is just to go through quickly the key issues as we move from 2010 or sought to move from 2001 really to 2015, and show to you how this CBDR is being reinterpreted and jettisoned in favor of a morally perverse concept which I call common but avoided or shifted responsibility. It didn't happen. They now set Cancun as a place to have this agreement, and it didn't still happen in Cancun, and in Durban, they knew that they needed at least 4 years to begin to hammer this agreement. They knew that if nothing was agreed in Durban, then the whole process would have died. Because again, the Kyoto Protocol ended here, and if nothing was agreed, that would mean the final death of the agreement. And so, bearing this in mind, they were doing all they could to negotiate an agreement in 2011 in South Africa, and I was physically there. Yet, no agreement was in view. In the last hours, they gathered together. Torsten entered the room, clutching his fire. And as soon as the conversation began, he said, guys, if equity is in, we are out. If equity is in, we are out. And then he went on to say, as far as U.S. is concerned, it's about maths. It's not morality. He went on to say, we are in this boat together. I don't understand why, India and China are always looking for this common but differential responsibility principle. And that shocked everybody. And you see, we are in this together. You keep your booties, your historical responsibilities, your gains, your growth, and then you ask the developing countries to roll faster. And so I will say this is ugly, okay? Hopefully you agree with me. Good, bad, ugly. This is really ugly. The terms used, ugly, the position was ugly. It was basically bullying the developing countries. But actually, do you know what? That he got his way. So in the Durban Agreement, which is the most fundamental agreement now leading to the negotiation that has formed the platform for the negotiation of the new agreement, there is no equity or common but differential responsibility in that document. What it rather says is that recognizing that climate change represents an urgent and potentially reversible threat to human society and the planet thus requires to be addressed by all parties, and acknowledging that the global nature of climate change calls for the widest possible cooperation by all countries. And India and China try to put, according to their differential, common but differential responsibility here, and that was when Torsten says, if you put that in, we are out. Now, all is not lost, but I will, as I will share, show in the next couple of slides, there are still some goods, some bad, and more ugly coming relative to 1990 baseline. But, so that's good, that's good. But, two things. First, there is still no understanding or agreement about when emission is going to peak, on how much emissions is going to be reduced, and who is going to do what. What China and India and developing countries were fighting for was that before agreeing such a goal, or that if you agreed on such a goal, global emission reduction, without adding equity and common differential responsibility, that's going to be like a cap on their developmental ambition. So they wanted a provision that says, okay, we will do our best to keep emissions below 2 degrees, or temperature rise below 2 degrees, but that development is still the priority for developing countries. What this means is that if at any point there is a conflict between emissions and development, development will trump. But that has not made its way into the agreement. That will has continued and will continue to provide a flashpoint in the agreement as we go on. I'm rushing because I want to leave as much time for conversation. The second key is that finally Kyoto has been softly killed. This idea that we will have, of course it still remains on, it's been put on life support basically on Durban, but it's been softly killed, and it will be emptied of its palatable content, and then divides nations into two and says, developing countries, you have quantified emission reduction targets. Developing countries, you don't. And we want to see this reduction target by this time, based on baseline. That is now out of the way. What you now will have, almost certainly I can tell you this, because I continue to be heavily involved in negotiation, is a bottom-up and voluntary measures. A raft of countries, what we call pledge and review. Every country will say, this is what I think I can do. Okay, and then the idea will be to try and design a system that holds them accountable and make sure that they do exactly as they have pledged. And of course, that will be supported by some form of pressure, making countries to ramp up their pledge. So Kyoto is almost as good as dead, because EU made it absolutely clear that they will not enter into any protocol agreement that keeps US away. They felt that they have borne the burden too much alone on their shoulders, and that they cannot continue because it's going to make their countries economically disadvantaged. With the likes of Russia, Australia, Japan, and Canada saying, we are not interested in Kyoto. That was already the end. Okay. By the time we got to Copenhagen, to Durban, we knew that Kyoto will not survive. Although, as a member of the team representing some African countries, we continue to push, and we will continue to push, not to retain Kyoto, but at least to get some of the equity concepts into the new agreement. But what you will have almost certainly is this kind of bottom-up voluntary measure, which in a sense is problematic. Because if you tabulate all the pledges that are currently on the table now, what it shows is a huge gap between what the IPCC science shows needs to happen and what the countries have pledged to do. So even if all the pledges are met, we are committed to at least 3.7 degrees temperature degrees rise by 2100. And that is not a good place to be. On a number of factors, but most crucially on the normative temperature or temper of the international community. And so to understand what constitutes the normative temperature, you have to look further afield where what is happening within the regime complex. For example, the rise in China and the emission of China, means that we are no longer in the 1992 world. And so we cannot, it's obvious to some of us that we cannot continue to talk about this Annex 1 and Annex 2 as if it is static. And of course, we also now have the increasing rise in the meat, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. The presidency of Bush Russian hot air, because after Russia signed into the accord, it suddenly realized that there's massive economic depression, leaving it with this huge amount of hot air, which was a threat to the economic interests of U.S. The expansion of EU, I've already alluded to that. The inclusion of the likes of Poland has changed the normative temperature, the financial crisis in 2008, and crucially also the rise of the Tea Party movement in the US. All of these things have come together to change the normative temperature of the international community, which means that certain moral terms or concepts or principles that were formerly agreed on are no longer tenable. And what we now see actually is a return almost of a certain relative interest calculation that is threatening to weaken the moral fabric of the UNFCCC. And you know, this shows, for example, China is now the highest emitter, okay? Far outstripped, well, it has outstripped the US. But remember again, that if you calculate in terms of per capita, US is still far above China, which then creates another ethical dilemma. Do you really believe in egalitarianism? That is, you know, all men are equal? Because China will say, no, this graph is not the right way. You must present the other graph that shows that when you divide absolute emission by number of people, that we are still far below. And so there are still a number of deep moral issues that we need to resolve as we move on to 2020. And it's going to be fascinating to see how these complex, Gordian knot, if you like, ethical issues are untied. Thank you. Is that a bad omen? I hope not.
Are there any questions?
Question?
Comments?
Yes, Peter.
In the sense of clarification, do you understand in your analysis differences between ethics and justice, or are you using the two terms interchangeably?
I tend to use the two interchangeably, although, you know, in philosophical debate that will be kind of atrocious. But no. We wouldn't, because, you know, you're speaking to essentially non-philosophical audience. But that said, justice is one of the central, if not the central, in my view, concept in ethics. But let me use that as an opportunity to actually say that within the broad ethical constructs, what I think I see is the movement away from right-based to need-based. Okay, understanding of how this thing should be calculated. Because India and China have now all but dropped their insistence to have per capita emission in the new regime. What they are now pushing is to say that developing countries have the need. No, I think I actually have it somewhere, where it says the developing countries the party should recognize an overriding commitment to poverty eradication and equitable share of sustainable development. Okay? So by moving away from per capita to an equitable share of sustainable development, or by talking about poverty eradication or development as a priority, it is now a movement away from right-based, anchored in per capita, to need-based, anchored in... We need development. Okay? We need, and I've actually argued somewhere that if you want to really understand, because you can have, even to say that we are committed to justice doesn't tell us much. It can be utilitarian justice, it can be market justice, it can be reciprocity, justice as reciprocity, it can be justice as need, it can be justice as right, it can be justice as in Nozikian term of entitlement. But what I have found in my own analysis is that there are three key concepts that define the moral, if you like, the moral core of international negotiation. One is equality of states, at least in theory. The second is need, and the third is differentiated capability. So you do as you can. Okay. we do need a moral theorization that tries to capture these three, but also recognizes the importance of this market. Because you know very well that the market is sacrosanct, and the U.S. will maintain the sacrosanct of the market for sometimes the sake of ideological purity. Because it's been proven, and ExxonMobil, for example, says there is nothing to shield categorically that emission trading works better than tax. And the notion that emission trading is market and tax is not is also quite false. But this sort of logic has been perpetuated through certain moral discourse that I think plays into a certain neoliberal worldview. But yeah. Sally.
The changes since 1992, that's all. When I first was a student, when I was first, learning about all of it.
It is huge.
Yeah, it's huge. And I'm thinking also about, you talked a lot about the BRICS. And what is the positionality of many of the other countries are even more vulnerable in terms of their, their participation in these debates?
Yeah.
Because, where do they stand?
Excellent question. At the end of the day, they may end up being the ones that are going to get burnt the most. Something happened in Copenhagen. Normally, when we are very close to a stalemate, you have the EU and the US in a closed door hammering the last-minute agreement. And the developing countries, especially the OASIS, that is the small island states, and Africa, they have an implicit trust in the EU, that the EU will represent their interests. There is this moral trust, and EU has worked quite hard to preserve that. 2009 December marked the end of that marriage or partnership. The last deal that was hammered, EU was not in the house. It was the BRICS and US that came together and hammered this past agreement, leaving EU and Africa in the code and overseas. And in Durban, we continue to see a lot of that. And some of my friends have argued in the literature, I disagree with this, but I respect that. That unless there is a bilateral agreement between US and China before 2015, that we may not even see a good, credible agreement in 2015. It shows us that if care is not taken, and I represent African countries a lot, and I've told them clearly, and it's on record, that they too need to be pushing for a more disaggregation, granularity, because when we just hear developing countries, you put China and Nigeria in the same basket. They need to be pushing. In a sense, the UNFCCC regime already recognizes a little bit of the least developing countries and the OASIS, but Africa is not mentioned anywhere in the two main documents. There is no mention of Africa in the UNFCCC agreement on the Kyoto Protocol. And that's a dangerous position to be, given the fact that about 98% of the deaths related to climate change happen in Africa.